cheese will help you sleep better at night. Yes, share. Like.
This is On Nutrition, a podcast from Mayo Clinic where we dig into the latest nutrition trends and research to help you understand what's health and what's hype. I'm Tara Schmidt, a registered dietitian with Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. This episode, nutrition news. But first, let's unpack some internet chatter in a segment we call Health or Hype. Recently, I came across a social media video convincing people to stop eating raw vegetables because they're coated in a dangerous biological substance called anti-nutrients. Now, anti-nutrients aren't commonly discussed in the nutrition world. This is more of a biology term. Anti-nutrients provide plants with protection from things like viruses, bacteria, and insects. And they may negatively affect how some nutrients enter your system or interfere with digestion or absorption. But some anti-nutrients in plant foods are also beneficial. They may be heart healthy, anti-carcinogenic, or provide antioxidants. So don't let TikTok convince you that there's a reason to skimp on raw spinach. It's also unlikely you're eating uncooked lima beans, or lima beans at all. If it's best for your body or mind to use strategies like soaking, boiling, or steaming to reduce the anti-nutrients in your foods, go for it. But if cooked vegetables give you the ick, that's okay. There's plenty of good stuff in the raw ones. Got a nutrition trend you want me to unpack? Send us a voicemail at 507-538-6272. I'd love to hear what strange or new ideas you've seen out there. Now, on to the show. If you've paid attention to the nutrition headlines in the last few decades, it'd make your head spin. Here are a few. Eating lots of chocolate helps people stay thin, study finds. Here's another. Is eating egg yolks as bad as smoking? And of course, my favorite, butter is back. Whether you get your nutrition news from the newspaper or your favorite video app, there's a lot of sensationalizing of science and pseudoscience. It's hard to decipher what's misinterpreted, what's factual, and what's just plain old nonsense. Here to help us fact-check our food news is our first repeat guest, Joy Heimgartner. Joy is a registered dietitian nutritionist at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. She's also an assistant professor of nutrition at the Mayo Clinic College of Medicine and Science and the primary dietitian for the hospital-based outpatient blood and marrow transplant program. You might recognize her voice from a previous episode called The Magic of Magnesium. Hi, friend.
Hello, Tara.
You were so popular last time that we just had to get you back.
It was a lot of fun, and I'm glad I'm back.
I think that this will be another important episode because we're talking all things nutrition news.
We're not going to touch on everything. We could probably talk about it for hours, but hopefully people will leave understanding how we can decipher the information in a way that helps us instead of makes us crazy.
Yes, and that's what you're here for. So I'm excited too. When we say the phrase nutrition news, what comes to mind? Is it trends like 30-30-30, food recalls, emerging research, or something else entirely?
When I think nutrition news, I decipher it pretty quickly based on where is it coming from? Am I reading it in a headline in a newspaper? Am I seeing it on somebody's blog? Am I getting it from a professional academy that is a source for dietitians for information? I hear a lot from patients and friends, consumers, questions about nutrition news, things they see in the headlines. That's where they're seeing a lot of their nutrition information.
TikTok is a big one lately.
Yeah.
I'm like, is that really where you're getting your information from?
And TikTok is the thing now. So I don't like to villainize one particular source because that doesn't really help us determine necessarily, is this something I can trust or not? 5 years ago, we would have been talking about Instagram. 5 years from now, we might be talking about something different. Mm-hmm. I will say that just a couple of years ago, Dublin City University did a huge study looking at TikTok. And, TikTok has 1.5 billion users every single month. These researchers, what they did is they wanted to evaluate health and wellness information that was on TikTok. And they specifically looked at the top non-credentialed influencers. So like not dietitians, not physical therapists, but people that are putting out nutrition and wellness information. This is 450 influencers from the US, UK, Australia, who had an average, I think, of 1 million followers each. So lots of visibility out there. They looked at 67,000 TikTok videos from those 450 mega influencers and determined that less than 2% of the information in those videos was accurate when it was compared to established public health guidelines. Our human brains tell us that the more we see something, the more true it must be. And in the advent of social media where things are put out there and they stay there forever, just this pile on and pile on and pile on of misinformation, it just tells our brain, well, it must be true. And I think we've all heard that as dietitians, as clinicians, but I've heard it so many places on the internet.
And you bring up a good point of that it's actually not necessarily the platform that may be the problem. It's who's speaking on the platform, right? And how many followers and how many shares, because we can get you TikTok famous, Joy. Like, hey, we can handle that.
This is the difference between talking about nutrition education and nutrition media. Media is marketing. Headlines should be compelling. That's what gets people to read the story. That's not wrong. That's what they're supposed to be doing. Some headlines are so compelling, people don't even read the article. They just share it right away.
That's all they need.
That's all they need.
Butter's back, baby.
Yeah. Cheese will help you sleep better at night. Yes, share, like. What's fascinating is our human brains process information really fast, and we rely on emotion and intuition to help fill in these gaps as mental shortcuts. And that can be really helpful if you're trying to make a quick decision based on a limited amount of information. But it really impairs our critical thinking skills, because when we're relying on emotion and intuition instead of facts, we are more likely to see something that we either find compelling, that we already agree with, so it aligns with
right about this.
That's right, our previously held beliefs, or something that stirs up some kind of emotion or anger or frustration or fear. I mean, a lot of nutrition information out there is really based on fear. So I think the first thing to do is understand, this is a quote from a fantastic dietitian, Melissa Joy Dobbins, the headline is not the bottom line.
I love that.
So if we read everything and say, headline's not the bottom line, and what is this making me feel? That helps us to step back and say, okay, initially, this is my bias towards this. Now I'm going to continue to read and see what we have to say.
Do you think most people are getting their information about nutrition from social media? Do you know where consumers are getting the majority of their facts or non-facts?
I tried to look that up, and I found that both social and traditional media, friends, family, websites, there are some people who will go to specific health-related websites to find information.
MayoClinic.org.
I mean, if you have a trusted source like that, that's certainly the first place I might go. I work in the cancer space, so a lot of cancer nutrition, and the American Institute for Cancer Research, AICR.org, is by far and away my favorite resource for myself and for my patients, because it takes research and does a lot of great translational information for patients to incorporate into their daily life. So that's great when people are using trusted resources like that.
And do you agree that even legitimate news outlets can be problematic when it comes to nutrition news?
Absolutely. As you said, it's not necessarily the source. We have to remember those headlines are hyped to be compelling. And a lot of times what is portrayed in the story itself may not really connect with the headlines. And then sometimes the studies that are talked about in the story don't conclude what the article might have you conclude. And I think it's common for consumers. They often read a headline about a nutrition topic or a study, and they assume that this study should change how they eat or what they consume. And so they're looking for that answer. And these headlines are often about single studies. And as scientists and researchers and clinicians, we know that we would never change recommendations based on a single study. That's not how science works. But in my 20 years of being a registered dietitian, I have come to realize that a lot of consumers, patients, they approach nutrition as a belief system, almost as a religion.
I agree with that.
And I think once I discovered this, it really changed the way that I talked with my patients. Because if you think about it like a belief system or a religion, nobody wants to hear that their beliefs are not true. That's like telling them they're wrong.
This is why we don't talk about nutrition on Thanksgiving with our families. We're like, leave us alone. Okay.
The problem is that beliefs do not always align with the facts. And as a dietitian, I am an evidence-based thinker. And that doesn't just mean I read a study and that study says this. So this is my evidence now. Evidence-based means that I think of nutrition research and headlines as this constantly growing and evolving and shifting sometimes set of facts and of associations. So a lot of people think of it as like nutrition recommendations are a moving target, and they're not a moving target. They're just this growing and evolving body of evidence. One of the things that consumers consistently say about nutrition information and why they don't trust it is that it feels like it's always changing. What they learned, 20 years ago about how many eggs they should eat is totally different now. And what they learned 15 years ago when everybody was told they should have a fish oil supplement, and now they're told, oh, no, that's not really good for most people, but only specific types of people. Consumers find that frustrating. But I think from a nutrition and evidence-based standpoint, that's what we want, right? We want the nutrition science to become more specific to patients. This is the individualized medicine that we're looking for. But what that means is that a lot of the single studies that we read, they're not generalizable to everybody. And if it's a good study, it'll say this is the population that the study was looking at, and this is what it can tell us. This is what it can't tell us. And that's a really important point.
Yeah. Well, and aren't you glad that your child's seatbelt is different than the one that maybe didn't even exist 15 years ago? Like, that's because the evidence for them or against the old ones or a new invention came. And I believe that my child is safer because of this new, very annoying seatbelt that they have to wear until they weigh 100 pounds. Like, they're a pain in my butt. Trust me, they're complicated. But that's how I approach this changing and this evolution, is that this is the science that we have now based on the brilliant minds who've been studying it for years.
That is a really great way to think about it. It's hard to translate these complex issues into like single sentence headlines.
Correct.
I always think it's interesting when I read an article about a nutrition study and they interview somebody and they say this person was not involved with the study. And I always think to myself, the reason they didn't talk to the author is that the author would do exactly what you and I do. We would equivocate like, okay, this is what we showed, but we didn't show this. And we still need to do more research on this because that's how research actually happens.
But I also find that news organizations sometimes will oversimplify it into a headline, like you said, or into a blanket statement. Butter is back.
Yeah.
Eat less fat. How else have you seen complicated research essentially dumbed down for the average consumer?
Well, when I read a nutrition article, the first thing I'm thinking to myself is, how is this going to add to the body of evidence that we already have? And I think consumers read it and they want to see black and white and they want an answer. Now, I will say that most online platforms and news sources will oftentimes link to the study. That doesn't mean the average consumer is going to be able to read and understand that. And in fact, sometimes people are just a little bit distracted by, oh, it actually is a real peer-reviewed study, so it must be what they're saying. This is where relying on some of those health organizations that do their own guidelines and synthesizing the evidence can be really helpful because they can help interpret some of the studies. And most places like American Institute for Cancer Research or American Cancer Society, American Diabetes Association, American Heart Association, they have websites and platforms where they have experts that are maybe blogging and posting about some of the things that are in the news and helping people to interpret those a little bit better. I think that's helpful for the consumer. But I don't think, the problem isn't science literacy necessarily. Like, we don't expect everybody to have a background in nutrition. It's really more about a little bit of the media literacy, noticing things that should be little red flags.
Can you think of an example when nutrition advice had to be like actually corrected, or something that you feel like the media really got wrong? I have one example I can think of.
Tell me an example of the one where they had to be corrected.
Well, I think this is more of an example of them being dumbed down, and it's related to fat intake. So if you look at the dietary guidelines from probably the 80s on, what was told to the public was like, eat less fat.
Yeah.
Consume a diet that is lower in fat. Consume a diet that is lower in saturated fat. And now it's like, please replace most of your sources of saturated fat with unsaturated fat.
Yeah.
And so what I read is that we've actually known that it's been specific to saturated and trans fats that we should be reducing in our diet the whole time, but that the media didn't think that we would understand that.
Ah,
Like the little ants.
too stupid to understand.
Essentially. And that you can see not only confused people, but even changed our entire food system, if I can
Yeah,
make that leap,
absolutely.
right? Like we had fat-free Pringles for a while. That didn't come out of nowhere.
And that perceived flip-flopping, it erodes trust in science, and that leads to more problems, like how much data can we put out there? How much can we translate this? Being able to be accurate and also stay compelling. I mean, let's be honest, accurate and science-based is not often very compelling, and there's important nuance in research that, frankly, when we attempt to explain those nuances, people's eyes glaze over.
When you look up nutrition news, it's important to consider the source. Is it coming from a well-researched website? Is the person relaying the news trustworthy? And remember, just because you hear the same nutrition tidbit over and over again doesn't mean it's true. Even reputable news sources sometimes get it wrong. They might oversimplify a title or make recommendations based on a single study, something scientists would never do. And remember, research is constantly changing. So even though last year's nutrition recommendations might no longer hold true, that's because our research is evolving and we're learning more. And that's a good thing. Next, we'll put some nutrition news right under the microscope. Joy, let's do a case study while I have you here.
All right.
I have an article with the headline, quote, "There's a secret superfood in white rice and pasta. Here's how to unlock it."
Oh, yeah.
Compelling. It's an understatement.
So compelling. So many red flags.
This is from NPR.
Yeah.
This is reputable, in my opinion. But the thesis here is that while carbohydrates can raise your blood sugar, yes, cooling white rice or pasta can reduce that glucose or blood sugar rise.
Yeah.
What's wrong with this article, Joy?
What's fascinating is that I just had this conversation with a group of friends that got together the day that they heard this radio story. And the question from my friend was, is that really true about cold pasta and rice? Okay, like something you heard about that story told you that, I should maybe question this a little bit.
They had a red flag moment.
They had a red flag moment, which I think is great. So first of all, when we talk about hyped headlines, like superfood, I can't stand that word because I don't like moralizing food in general, calling it naughty, which they also call certain types
or
of
toxic. Like, that's not a toxin. You drink alcohol. Don't talk to me about toxins.
In this story, they actually talk about naughty carbohydrates. I was like, ugh.
Really?
It's a dietitian who says, well, some carbs we think of as naughty. They're digested really quickly and they can spike blood sugars really quickly. So we would not call them naughty carbohydrates. We would call them
easily digestible
okay, carbohydrates. If I was an endurance runner, I'd be looking for all the quote unquote naughty carbohydrates I could find to power me through a 100-mile trail run. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so the story, they're really talking about this study that came out. And what's really nice is this is a great study. This is not a single study. This is what's called a meta-analysis, which is a study of studies.
We love those.
And we can talk later about kind of the hierarchy of evidence in studies, but meta-analyses are considered kind of the peak. This is a meta-analysis that looked specifically at something called resistant starches. And they looked at resistant starches in people who either have prediabetes or have diabetes. So they're called resistant starches because they resist digestion in your small intestine, where carbohydrates are generally broken down and absorbed into your bloodstream. They resist that digestion and go on to move into your large intestine or your colon. Now, there are 5 different kinds of resistant starches. Resistant starch type 3 is the kind of resistant starch that is created when you take things like white pasta, white rice, and cool them down till they're cold. And so it rearranges the structure to make them less able to be digested in your small intestine, so they travel into your large intestine. So yes, cold pasta, cold rice is a source of resistant starch. Absolutely. But
I knew there was a but coming.
And the study is really well done, and it's really explained very well. For this meta-analysis, they looked at 31 different studies of people who either had diabetes or prediabetes and what the effect of the intake of different resistant starches were. So, of these 31 studies, they were able to say that resistant starch type 1 and 2, those two types of resistant starches, did have impacts on glucose. They were different impacts. They did slow glucose rise in some patients, some more than others. But the other conclusions were that the other types of resistant starches, they could not make any conclusions. And in fact, they say resistant starch type 3 did not affect glycemia or glucose change. So, yes, cooling down pasta and rice makes more resistant starch. Does that impact glycemia? That's not what the study showed.
Should we call it a superfood? Definitely not.
And I think that's the thing, right? For you and I as dietitians, our take home is, how would this impact what I talk to patients about? Well, I'm not going to talk to my patients and say, you should eat white rice and pasta. No, you should eat more whole grains. We know that those things have lots of resistant starches in them. We know they also provide you with vitamins and minerals that you're not going to get from white pasta and white rice. Now, if you cool down your brown rice, you also get more resistant starch. But I think it's a really interesting example of taking sort of a general whole group of food types, so resistant starches, but then generalizing that to something that actually wasn't shown in the study.
So there's a lot of misinformation out there. It's because the data is being poorly interpreted in some cases. You mentioned earlier the hierarchy of evidence, of which studies we trust the most and which studies are maybe less robust. Let's talk about that.
As clinicians, we often think about evidence in a hierarchy, sort of this pyramid of the quality of evidence. It's one way to rank research based on its strength and ultimately how it should be applied and communicated to consumers. At the bottom of that pyramid would be something like animal studies. Sometimes animal mechanistics and physiology are nothing like they are in humans.
We are not rats.
That's right. So that's kind of the bottom of the pyramid. Coming up from the bottom, we've got case studies, expert opinions, anecdotes. You see a lot of that sort of thing on social media. A lot of different types of observational studies. So prospective observational studies looking at things that have happened in the past to large groups of people, cross-sectional studies. Above that, we've got randomized controlled trials. And then if you think about the things at the top being the best, highest quality, that's that meta-analysis, systematic review, studies of studies. So a lot of nutrition research falls in that middle part, that observational studies, those prospective cohort studies, retrospective cohort studies, cross-sectional studies. And that's okay because good quality observational studies can give us very strong evidence. And every single type of study will add to important information about a topic. The thing is that observational studies are general information about tendencies in a population. They're just associations. They cannot tell us causation.
There's a lot
studies,
of confounding factors here.
But that makes sense, right? A lot of long-term health concerns develop over decades, and they're a result of many factors. You can't do a randomized controlled trial about that. We don't eat nutrients. We eat foods, and we eat a variety of foods within a diverse diet. So it wouldn't be ethical or even feasible to do randomly controlled trials for a lot of the nutrition research is done. That's okay. Observational studies take place over a long period of time. They're very large study populations, and that can add to the strength of observational studies. But that always has all those confounding factors. So we can't be equivocal all the time about this is what's going to happen. If you don't eat at least 3 servings of leafy greens, you're going to get cancer. We can't say that. What we can say is that people who eat more than 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day have a reduced risk of certain types of cancer. And people don't like that equivocation, but we can't say those specific things. If you're testing a drug, it's easy. You can do a randomized controlled trial. It can be blind. You can give somebody a placebo and somebody the drug. We find out all the consequences of what happens to both sides of that coin. That's not food. And it's unrealistic to think we're ever going to have that. But of course, more nuance adds to more confusion.
Who decides which studies get completed?
A lot of studies that we decide to do are based on unanswered questions from previous studies. So I think a lot of when we talk about who's going to decide what studies are done, a lot of it is based on what have we learned from other research and how do we push that research forward to make it more applicable to everyone or find out the differences in different populations.
sometimes the science itself is flawed. So, for example, a lot of study subjects are men, or at least were men for many years, which means,
Mhm.
okay, now the research is not accounting for how different bodies can be impacted by medication or diet. Do you feel like the lack of diversity can then skew research results?
Absolutely. I mean, there was not a law passed until 1993 that said women had to be included in
93?
research studies. 1993. You were
Yikes.
probably even alive then.
I was around.
Yes. So even though women represented 51% of the population, they still represent about 40% of research study subjects. And when we talk about women of color, they
Mhm.
have even less representation. So it is really important to include all different types of people. We need to be representing everybody's situation, not just their genetic situation, but also their social situation, their
Yes.
economic situation, because those things matter. Just having access to different care, to different nutrition, to different food affects your entire way you move around
Mhm.
health and nutrition. And if we're not setting the real life scenarios of what it's like for people, that's not going to be generalizable to our population.
Be careful of misinformation when getting your nutrition news. Even if a study itself is sound, sometimes its data is interpreted poorly by news sources. If you want to feel really solid about your source, you can always refer to the hierarchy of evidence and opt for, say, a meta-analysis instead of an animal study. In other cases, the science itself is flawed. So if you really want to get to the bottom of things, ask yourself, who conducted the study? Who were the subjects? And did they represent a broad spectrum of people? Next, we'll teach you how to spot red flags within your nutrition news. How do you help people decipher between, let's call it junk science, and a reputable study? Because you can find a study to support just about anything. Like if you Google
Absolutely.
why I should eat more of X, good, bad, or otherwise, you'll probably find something to support that. So what are the signs of, okay, this is a reputable source and a reputable study itself, right?
So I myself, as a clinician, as a patient, I almost always start with consensus guidelines. So as we sort
Yes.
of talked about, most health organizations, American Diabetes Association, American Heart Association, American Cancer Society, that American Institute for Cancer Research have consensus guidelines. And these help to take all of the research that exists and evaluate it. And by evaluating, it's not just the specific studies, it's the types of studies, the strengths of studies, what did they show, their generalizability. These consensus guidelines are usually put together by large groups of people, which
Over
takes out some
years.
over years. They're usually updated like every 5 years, every 10 years. So it can help take out a lot of the bias that people are concerned about single author
Mhm.
things. And usually it will give you really good information about specific topics. So, for instance, in the American Cancer Society's guidelines for diet and physical activity for cancer prevention, if you just look at dairy, it will give you the information about dairy for breast cancer, dairy for prostate cancer. And so it's really specific and really helpful. It translates that research into practical guidelines for patients. The one that I think is the most amazing is the American Institute for Cancer Research is part of what's called the CUP Globals, and CUP is just an acronym for CUP, which is Cancer Update Program. It is an international consensus guideline about cancer risk reduction, prevention, survivorship. It's the largest cancer prevention database in the world. It's international research. Because remember, the US isn't the only place that's doing great research on nutrition and diet and wellness. It's happening all over the world. So there's really nothing else like it. The research is evaluated by panels of leading experts, and then those help to inform recommendations for cancer risk reduction, prevention, survivorship. And it's just a really helpful translational information of research to what the consumer can do.
Yeah. What resources are out there to help people fact check nutrition news, right? Especially if they're getting it from social media or the lay media.
There's a couple of great resources that I use as a dietitian. The International Food Information Council, it's called IFIC, has a wonderful guideline called Understanding and Interpreting Food and Health Scientific Studies. It's guidance for nutrition communicators, but it's really helpful as a consumer as well. They talk about some of the 10 red flags of junk science, which are helpful for consumers to see. I like their resources. There's a couple of dietitians who do an excellent job of translating research into information that I follow. They've got podcasts and blogs. One of them is Melissa Joy Dobbins, who has a Soundbites RD. There's podcasts, she has a website. She has a great science toolkit for dietitians. Another is Karen Collins, and I think she's at Karen Collins Nutrition. And she is the dietitian who helps to write information for the AICR. They're very good about not just knowing the research, but helping to relay that research to clinicians, to patients. I find those really helpful.
Thank you. What are some of those 10 red flags of junk science?
Those 10 red flags of junk science that IFIC talks about, anything that promotes a rapid, quick fix, dire warnings of danger, those things that stimulate fear.
Don't eat apples. They're, I don't know.
Yeah. Claims that sound too good to be true. I mean, sometimes our brains, we should trust the fact that that doesn't sound right.
Mm-hmm.
Simplistic conclusions that are drawn from a complex study, like you've mentioned that several times. Any recommendations that are based on a single study. Dramatic statements that are refuted easily by other science. Anytime you see lists of good and bad foods, those things to me are a red flag.
Get me out of here. Mm-hmm.
We don't moralize food. Food is food. Some of it contributes more to our health than other food does, but it's not good or bad. Anything that recommends something that sells a product, I mean, that is an immediate red flag.
Oh,
that,
yeah.
Yeah, let's create a fear and a problem for you, and then I'm going to sell you the solution for it. I don't think that's ethical at all. Any recommendations that are based on studies without published peer review. This is a really important topic right now. There's things that are being put out there online and people are calling them peer-reviewed. That's not scientific peer review. And then any recommendations for studies that ignore differences among groups of individuals.
Mm-hmm. And what are some green flags to look for when we're researching a study?
So some of the studies that I read that I trust the most are when the authors say, these were our biases that we recognize in the study, and these are the limitations we recognize from the study. Those things should always be in a study. And then funding sources should always be listed in a study as well. And the funding sources should talk about what did they fund? Did they just provide product? Did they help develop the methodology for the study? Are they influencing what can be published about the study? Those are things that are important to know about a funder for a study. But just being a funder for a study doesn't mean that you should throw that information out. That's how we get research done.
Yeah, no money, no mission, right?
That's right.
And ideally, even though they've provided money to fund the article, the research, et cetera, they have no influence on the outcome. That's actually how we handle things like advertising here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Joy, as always, thank you for teaching me. Thank you for the huge impact you have on our patients' lives, their families, and I'm going to get you a TikTok account. You just wait. You can dance if you want to.
I had TikTok for a hot minute and it was too much.
We'll get you an agent and everything and a choreographer at the least.
Thank you so much for having me, Tara. I love coming on to talk with you. You always remind me of things that patients and consumers are thinking about and how we can make sure we're thinking about things differently so they get their questions answered. And that's what Mayo Clinic is all about.
One of the best resources when fact-checking your nutrition news is consensus guidelines, when various trusted health organizations take all existing research that exists on a topic and evaluate it. These guidelines can be full of tips for consumers. We have more of the resources Joy mentioned listed in the show notes. Remember, it's good to have a little bit of skepticism when your friend sends you a nutrition article that sounds just too good to be true. When you know how to assess a study and what red flags to look for, it's harder to be fooled by the next flashy headline. That's all for this episode. But if you've got a question or topic suggestion, you can leave us a voicemail at 507-538-6272. We might even feature your voice on the show. On the next episode of On Nutrition, fueling exercise.
I want food to be someone's ally. It's their greatest training partner.
For more On Nutrition episodes and resources, check us out online at mayoclinic.org/onnutrition. if you found the show helpful, please subscribe and make sure to rate and review us on your podcast app. It really helps others find our show. Thanks for listening, and until next time, eat well and be well.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as medical or legal advice. Always consult with a qualified healthcare provider for any medical questions. The appearance of any guest does not imply an endorsement of them, their employer, or any entity they represent. The views and opinions are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of Mayo Clinic. Reference to any product, service, or entity does not constitute an endorsement of or recommendation by Mayo Clinic.
Warning, the following ZipRecruiter radio spot you are about to hear is going to be filled with F words.
When you're hiring, we at ZipRecruiter know you can feel frustrated, forlorn even, like your efforts are futile, and you can spend a fortune trying to find fabulous people, only to get flooded with candidates who are just fine. Fortunately, ZipRecruiter figured out how to fix all that. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/zip. With ZipRecruiter, you can forget your frustrations because we find the right people for your roles fast, which is our absolute favorite F word. In fact, 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day.
Fantastic.
So, whether you need to hire 4, 40, or 400 people, get ready to meet first-rate talent. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/zip to try ZipRecruiter for free. Don't forget, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip. Finally, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip.